So I'm going to give a brief introduction. It's great to have David and Pam Kidd on the call, and I know we have some folks that are Woodmont folks that used to be at Hillsborough Presbyterian Church. David served as pastor there for 38 years, and so I'm going to give a brief introduction. It could be a lot longer, but I want to reserve the time for him tonight. So what I'm going to do is, David, I got to know David through his son, Brock Kidd, who's also on the call. And Brock and Corinne have been coming to Woodmont for some time now. But Brock actually wrote this. And so I'm going to read this in Brock's honor to introduce his dad, because I think that'll be meaningful. And so I got to hear Brock give this introduction on another call a few months ago. So let me read this from David's son, Brock. Brock said, "Dad, with your civil rights work in the 60s and marrying Mom and the dynamic duo marriage that began with your ministry to the poorest in Kaywood, Kentucky, to saving a dying Hillsborough Pres church way back in the day, the refugee project in the 70s, the first of many of its kind in Nashville, the decades-long partnership with Spruce Street Baptist that is still going on today, Dad, your representation of the U.S. Presbytery and your trip to fight apartheid in South Africa in the 80s, your work with the Eritrean people and Lost Boys, Hillsborough's Special Needs Ministry, the Friendship Class, the Heart House, Mom being the power partner the entire way, establishing the Christmas gift program for the poor that started at rural Hillsborough School and now gives Christmas for hundreds of children through Spruce Street Baptist, and of course, your Zimbabwe ministry, Joan and Paddington and Alice and Village Hope and the dozens of orphans you have now saved. And there's so much more to list and cover, but we don't have the time to list them all. Tonight, it's a privilege. Those words are from Brock Kidd about his father, David Kidd. It's a privilege to have Dr. David Kidd as our guest, along with his wife, Pam. David, we're grateful to have you, and I'm going to turn it over to you. We got to get you unmuted there. Amber may have muted you. Perfect.
Does it work? Are we good?
Good to go.
Okay. All right. Well, I just said, I wish you hadn't read that. I mean, where do we go from here? Okay. So what I'd like to try to do tonight is to interlace this majestic creation story, the first one being the first chapter of Genesis and going into the fourth verse of the second chapter, with a little bit of scientific detail. So if we start, and I think maybe I've tried to, so I've got this, let me see if you all can see this. Can you see this? Can you make that out? Okay, is that so everybody could do it? Because you can do it, Clay, everybody can do it. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it.
Well, the reason I post this is it's a drawing that I got off the internet by a Hebrew scholar of the cosmology of the early Hebrews. And what you're going to see is it's a completely different worldview than what we have today. But it's kind of important to understand how they saw the world so we can get into these verses and get some sense of what it is they're saying. And what you're going to notice is that in the beginning, I guess maybe I'll just go through this first, then we'll go back to pick up the verses. But what God does is God moves into this chaos, this sort of formless chaos, which is interpreted as void. In the beginning, there was virtually nothing. And so a void, actually, to drill a little deeper, it is a kind of chaos. But anyway, so God organizes the universe, and what he does, they separate this ocean. This is an ocean up here. So God separates this ocean from the ocean under the earth, And there's a platform, if you can see this. This is the earth. It's held up by pillars, which go down through the sea under the earth and anchor there like like pilings on a bridge. They hold the earth up, and there are pilings that hold the sea of heavens up on either side. And there, it's this line under the sea of heaven. Think of it as a drape that is interlaced with the little lights. So we've got a dark sky up here that forms the bottom of the sea of heaven and opens up this area here. This is the light where God, we know, will call for light. And then the stars are up here on the rim, and the sun is that, which one of the stars. This is the underworld, and this is just the sea. Okay, so do we have this? Are we okay? Got it? Hello.
We got it. Got it.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, so let's just take a look at these verses. In fact, let me get my Bible. I've got this typed out. But... So we've got this, the traditional translation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the earth, face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the water. So you just get this kind of imagery. And God said, let there be light. And what we're going to see in this first story is, more than anything else, is the supreme authority, the power of God, which is expressed in the story very economically by simply God saying, let there be light, and it happens. There's no intermediary work to be done. It's all done, period. God speaks, and the universe, the light bursts forth, and then the subsequent days follow, and each of them are obedient as well. And it's something that by the sheer power of God's command, everything comes forth. And so let's just pick it up with the light. God sees the light and separates the light from the darkness, and that's what you see with that conical world there. And calls the light day, and the darkness he calls night. And there was evening and morning of one day. Now, that structure is what we're entering into this noble poem, essentially, that is going to talk about the architecture of the world from the Hebrew point of view, and they consider the glory of that. And what you're going to notice first off is the light is just an issuance. We don't have heavenly bodies here yet. We just have light. I like to have you think about the creatio ex nihilo, which is a creation out of nothing, a doctrine that was developed in the 12th century. Some of the Hebrew scholars were working it up in the 10th century AD. But this imagery has its power because it follows roughly the sequence of what we know scientifically to be the case. So when and I'm thinking now of the Big Bang, when the Big Bang it explodes, we're basically looking at what the astronomers consider to be practically nothing. It's not a vain thing to suggest that what we're looking at essentially is nothing at all. It's a compression that's so infinitesimally small at the beginning, if we follow the astrophysics back to the moment when it takes place, that essentially it is nothing. So we can start there in both of these stories. We can start there and we can bring the science in, and we can be pretty comfortable with that. We need to be careful not to be too literal. But so we've got this kind of concurrence between these two ways of looking at the world, And I think if we sit loose with it and we let the poetry, the literature speak to us from the standpoint of this kind of glorious imagery of God setting about the work of creation, and try to find our way through the science, it's not terribly difficult. Let's just go quickly through it, and then let me see what you all think. So now we've got a firmament in the midst of the waters, right? We've got this arching canvas that's holding up the waters of heaven, this structure that separates the waters above from the waters beneath. And this is, now we're at verse 6. Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the firmament and separated the waters which were under the firmament. Think about that drawing, from the waters that were above the firmament, and it was so. And God looks and is fine. So now we're on the second day. The third day, the dry land and vegetation now begins. In terms of life going ashore, this is pretty much the way it happens. We think that probably sometime around, probably about 3.5 billion years ago, these cells were forming in the water and in the seas, and they begin to inch ashore in the form of lichens, kind of a mat of bacterial one-celled creatures and that kind of thing. So just think about a mat of this stuff, this vegetation. So, there again, we're not too far off. I'm not going to go through the whole thing this way and bore you to tears, but I want you to get this image of what's happening here. There's a process that's undergoing here that is moving through time toward more and more organization of the heavens and the earth. Now we've got life that's coming ashore in this very primitive way. On the fourth day, and this is another interesting piece here. The fourth day, the moon and the stars, you'll notice that the sun comes in the fourth day. And so people who have this inclination to want to argue about there being a 7-day creation, it pretty quickly folds up. We don't even have a sun for a 24-hour day until the fourth day of the creation story. So that gives us a warning that we need to be pretty careful dealing with this literature and not trying to hold it to things that it's not suggesting. Now we've got the stars, and we've got light, and we've got dark, and we've got the moon, and we've got this separation into these what we recognize as a day. And the fifth day, we've got birds and fish. So we know that when fish came ashore, we've got this vegetation ashore that goes in one direction. That's the plant life. When creatures first were able to live on the land, they came in the form of, probably we think of these lungfish, these very primitive fish that had air sacs. And so much of the evolutionary story, apart from Genesis, is a story of the unlikely, the improbable. Where, for an example, to take the Crossoptergian, the lungfish, this is a creature that survives arid times through creating this kind of cell of muck. So when there's a dry season, everything else up there it dies out, but it's got this little sac around itself in the mud, and it survives by elbowing its way from one pond to another, from one water source to another, and that essentially becomes what we know as legs. But there's a pretty good likelihood that's about what happened when we get to the vertebrates. We're starting to look now at animals in very primitive form, but they are on land. So that's what's developing here. Of course, the birds come much later. We're not going to worry about too much detail there. So the sixth day, well along, and this also follows the Genesis story as well as the scientific one. Now we begin to get these creatures. They start talking about mammals and animals like that, which come along quite late in the evolution of life on Earth. And then we've got man being made in God's image, and we see that that's a place where we can very easily stub our toes. What do you think that means? What does that mean to you? Being in the image of God. Anybody? What do you think?
I see Chip.
Question.
What's that?
That's a big discussion question, and everybody debates it. And
Yeah.
I've got my answer, but
Well, what is your answer, Roy? Let's just toss around a few.
I simplify it. That God is love. Being in the image of God means we're created with the ability to love.
Yeah. I was visiting chaplain years and years ago at the Tennessee State Penitentiary and sat in on a chapel meeting. And there was this guy who started talking about, who started going through Genesis, and he made the point, and he'd stand up there, in a kind of a hysterical voice, and he'd say, "What do you see here? You see a hand with 5 fingers, not 6, not 10, 5 here, 2 hands, 2 arms. That's what it means to be in the image of God. So God looks like a big us." And that, I don't think most of us would buy that. But there is that kind of imagery, and it wasn't completely foreign to the early Hebrew view of things.
Dr. Kidd, could I make a comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
I took a while to get myself unmuted. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was trying to get on there, but I realized that my talking was not coming through. I was just going to make a comment about the image of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think my understanding is that when we're made in the image of God, the likeness of God, first of all, we are intelligent, rational creatures. We're able to think. We're able to design great buildings. We're able to make cars and airplanes, that type of thing. We also, part of being made in the image of God is we're able to appreciate things like beauty, a beautiful flower, a beautiful butterfly, these things that we have in some small sense from God. We're also created as persons with personality.
Mm-hmm.
We have not only consciousness like the animals have. When a tiger comes up to an antelope out in the plain, and the antelope is conscious enough to run, but we have self-consciousness. And we have a ability for relationships, which is different from all the animals, all of other creation. And in the ability to have relationships, we have relationships on a horizontal level with, of course, our friends and wife and family, et cetera. And then obviously on a vertical level. That's what I think about when I think about being made in the image of God.
Uh-huh.
And that makes us different from all the animals.
Right.
We had life breathed into us by God himself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Anybody else? What I see here, I would make a cautionary observation. Our separation from some of the higher primates is a little bit slimmer than we used to know. They also have relationships and are capable of tool use, which is something anthropologists years ago simply had no idea would be possible because it involves abstract thinking. But I think in terms of a more detailed self-consciousness and more developed detail in our relationships, the components of those, I think that's a good observation. I always like to think of some combination of what Roy said and yours. It's interesting that what we get in this early description of humankind is this idea of dominion. And exactly what that means, that's also debatable. I mean, does that mean we can just run reckless over the earth and everything, we can just burn it up? Well, we could, but I think it doesn't hurt to keep in mind way in the background, this is God's garden. It's not ours. But to have dominion requires exactly what you've just said. It requires an intelligence, a pre-planning, an ability to do engineering, and at the very least to make even the most primitive stone tools require an awareness of what these conchoidal fractures that you can put in these glassified rocks. So there's no question. There's a clear celebration, a separation. I'm sorry, between the human intelligence and any other kind. I mean, and I don't think probably most of us would debate that. I don't mean to be saying animals don't have their worth. They obviously do, or that we can't, they can't love us, which they can. But I think that it's not a hard case to make that one of the things that becomes godlike is this capacity of power to control our destinies, to control the physical universe. I mean, there's no creature that can do what we can do in terms of flying, digging, being under the water, living there, going into space, all those sort of things. There's a kind of mechanical mastery that's involved in that. That I'm sure from the standpoint of the animal kingdom, appears godlike. I mean, it is dominion, and that's how we get it. Early human beings were just in a gray zone as they began to evolve into Homo sapiens, and some of the early hominids were, they could make a fire. Sometimes they could. We see cracked stones that are fire stones that they have, but not much else. I'm being instructed by my wife. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. Well, the point being, to be in the image of God, it has to be that we're capable of holding binding, deeply profound emotions like love. And otherwise, a God of love makes no sense. And what we see that understanding of God itself evolve over a period of time from these early stories to the time when Jesus comes along. We see it increasing in its intensity in the prophets. But we certainly would not want to abandon that. So we've got to have this sense of the capacity to love. We've got to have the capacity to forgive. We also have to have, as you were saying, this capacity to organize the world, to work it, in a sense. So being in the image of God, I think, does it. And to me, I like to think where that must immediately lead, which is responsibility. So we can make a decision, but we are responsible for that decision. And I think it's important, and clearly this is consequential upon the nature of our creation, as we're going to see in chapters 2 and 3. We got to bear responsibility for what we do, and it's going to happen. Well, in fact, we know that's true. I mean, we are creatures of consequence, and we turn loose our own destinies. But I think that's a very important understanding of who we are. What does it mean to be godlike? Well, it means to be caring, if we think about what's godlike, we think about what's highest of godlike. What we think as Christians is Jesus. So we've got this incarnation of God, and what do we see? We see a self-giving love, a self-sacrificing love, and of course, he manifests in the miracles as power, but that's secondary. So we are creatures who are responsible. We're creatures who can understand. We're creatures who can, in fact, I thought you were quite eloquent about that, who can wonder, who can be moved by art, by music, who are capable of forming relationships, both secondary and primary. That is, we can form relationships that don't have a whole lot to do with people per se, but we serve one another, right? A bus driver drives a bus. I mean, we can take these roles. And so that we're capable of all these different things, and we could go on and elaborate that forever, as Roy was saying. I mean, this is a topic unto itself, and you could spend a year in a seminar and not have it exhausted. But I do think it's important as we go forward to have that in mind. What is it that we are? How has God created us? Which is going to become important in this question. who are we to become? What are we to be at our best? I mean, if you think about God creating us with something in mind as a completed product, what does that look like? So, and we'll move over into that. We're going to see in the second two chapters a kind of an archetype of human nature, which is very interesting. So we go through this the breath of life. Incidentally, here's another little interest. I'm sorry for jumping back and forth. This is not a forum that I'm accustomed to. I'm not accustomed to look at a damn television and doing this. So I hope you'll forgive me.
Just at least we got rid of the hackers. That made it even more difficult.
Clay, I this is territory that I just am not comfortable with. But it's interesting when we see these little insights, these bursts of the narrative that come through that begin to amplify our own understanding of what these early Hebrews thought. Breath, human life begins when we breathe, when you take your first breath. Now, there are two understandings of the beginning of a human being, but life in a human being by the early Hebrew understanding is breath, which is the same word in Greek as pneuma, as spirit. So these arguments about being formed in the womb and that kind of stuff that we see in some of the more psalmody scriptures are kind of later, but this is an interesting thought that they had. So now we get to the seventh day, and the seventh day, of course, God looks at everything; it's all good, and God rests. So we don't have evil coming into the picture yet. We're gonna bring that along with us, but at this point, it's not there. I want to just go back and share some things that to me are, inspiring. When we've got these people telling this story, to take a case of what they're seeing when they're seeing the sun and the stars. If a shepherd was to lie on his back and look into the sky on a clear night and had perfect vision, that person might be able to see 5,000 stars, possibly, on a good night. Well, we know, and that's being celebrated here. That's this gorgeous universe, this beautiful place draped with stars. We know in our solar system, in our galaxy alone, there are probably about 150,000 million suns. About 150,000 million stars in our galaxy. There are billions of galaxies. So the ability one has to ask, well, what kind of God is this? We're not talking about some little thing inside of a balloon here. I mean, what we've got is a universe of unspeakable scale, and it's very difficult to get our heads around that, which is an appropriate thing to keep in mind when you think about a divine force. What is it that God has brought forth? A whole lot more than is being talked about here in the scripture, which is simply more than they knew. And one of the things that we find in science is that the more we know, the more elaborate the texture of the universe becomes. And so, to me, more to celebrate, more the glory of God. I think that probably the most helpful thing to think about Genesis, or at least to me, is it forms a kind of a skeleton, a kind of framework. And the science can come along and it begins to try to fill out the questions of why, of how. How did God do this? There's no explanation here whatsoever. We've got nothing that tells how God did it. God speaks and it happens. But science can come back and provide a flesh and muscle to that bone and fill it out. And it's a beautiful, intricate, terrible sometimes story, narrative. And but I think that the more you see it, the more elaborate and intrinsically complicated it becomes. So we don't want, as Christians, to back away from this story. What we want to do is do a little work to fill it out if we need to. If there are people who have a problem seeing a help in this. So I don't know how much time you want to go back and spend in detail here, but that's kind of the framework. I wish we were sitting around together. I could see your faces, and it would be. This is not a.
I wish we were sitting around together too, David.
Yeah. Okay, so well, that's roughly the way I see it. I mean, we could go into a lot of detail, and I've done that many times before. But that's
David, picking up on what you just said, I've never been one that saw any conflict between religion and science. I don't think you do either. I think, again, I like quick to the point answers, but the creation story tells us why. It's the why question, whereas evolution, the science description is the how.
Right, exactly.
And they go hand in hand.
Yeah, Genesis 1, I think we could say would be tells us the who.
And one other observation I'd make in light of what Chip Lynn said and what you're saying is that in the image of God, we have also the creative ability. God is creator, and as you described, outer space and the universes, and the more we know, the more there is to find. And the universe keeps expanding, the scientists tell us, which means the process of creation is ongoing, and being created in God's image, we are to be a part of that ongoing process of creation.
Right.
Hopefully in a positive way, not a negative way.
Yeah, we've got to sort that out yet, don't we, Roy?
Yeah.
As a species. Yeah, I agree. I think that's right. And you're certainly right in terms of our understanding of the scientific dimension that we can bring over the story. So, the story will collapse if we make it be too literal, but I don't think that's what's intended here. I think, as you said, it really, what we started with chapter 1, we start with God, a God of infinite power, creative power. And essentially, from the standpoint of Genesis, God says, let it be, and it is, and you don't need to know anymore. I mean, that's essential. That's the faith part of it. But you're right. That's, in fact, how we calculate the age of the universe. We just track it back from this this expansion formula, and we end up about 13.7 billion years ago. So you're absolutely right. And the more we know, the more complicated it gets. When you get into the 20th century and you get into quantum mechanics, it'll totally blow your mind. I mean, it's just so counterintuitive and contrary to anything that we experience in our lives here that it is a wonder. So what has happened over the course of the last several centuries after Newtonian mechanics, which deals with our material world, we begin to see, and by the time when Einstein came along, there wasn't a thought that there was another plane to be looking at. Everything worked according to Newtonian mechanics, and it was brilliant, and you could send a man to the moon with it, and you did. But then quantum mechanics comes along and shows us a whole new universe, a whole new world beneath in the subatomic world, which has its own principles. So, I mean, all that's saying is that science is unearthing depths that were unforeseen. And I don't see any reason to suppose that's not going to continue to happen. There's so much more we don't know than what we do know. And presumably science is going to, I hope, if we can live that long, is going to march forward and make these discoveries. So.
Can I throw one other quick question at you? Going back to your drawing.
Questions would be helpful, Roy.
But you said that the Hebrew world was different from the way we understand the world today. Would you want to make any observations about how their understanding of God is different from our understanding of God or to put it another way, the Old Testament understanding versus the New Testament understanding?
Yeah. Well, I know you know, Roy, that evolves over time. I mean, these stories, for an example, we think that probably scholars today think these are probably 5th and 6th century BC stories that were written. Largely were kind of compressed during the exile, the Babylonian exile. But in fact, these stories are ancient in one form or another, and they evolved over a period of time. Probably they were being told around campfires 3,000 years before Christ. I mean, just a very primitive nomadic people. And they picked up Mesopotamian stuff and began to organize it. But their vision of God that becomes harmonious with our own comes probably around the time of the exile, when they begin to see, to begin with, there's a kind of harsh monotheistic view of things. God does everything, good, bad, and different, and ours is not to wonder why. We just get ground up in it or made in it, and that's the way it is. And then it begins to soften some over a period of centuries. By the time that we are looking at biblical texts like this, like these two, they're proclaiming God's control over the heavens and the earth, and that's just absolute. So we have a monotheistic religion fully developed by this time. Earlier, we can see that, they had gods, right? That was a problem that Moses had with Aaron and his golden calf. They lived among other peoples who had polytheistic beliefs, and they kind of whipsawed back and forth into and out of that sort of stuff. But there was this evolving sense of the power of God, and the beauty of God, the magnificence of God, such that you don't mention the name of God. God is totally ineffable. You can't think of anything that's like God. You can't imagine it. And when you do, you're wrong. We see that in the no other gods before me, and so on and so forth. But I hope that addresses briefly your question. It doesn't look like I've carried the day.
David, one other comment or question.
No, that can go on, and that, like other things, can go on and on discussion.
Oh yeah.
That's fine. That's good.
Yeah,
This
question about it.
This idea of being made in the image of God, that leads to what is called an anthropomorphic understanding of God, where we picture God as the old man in the sky, because if we think if we're made in the image of God, then God must be human, must be an old man in the sky with a beard, and yet that is that's so limiting. J.B. Phillips's book, Your God is Too Small.
Right.
So I guess my question is, in what ways has the anthropomorphic concept of God, that I think results from, one, the words of Jesus for many Christians, Father, talking about Father, right? But also just this idea that if we're made in the image of God, then God must be like us, right?
Yeah.
How do you think through that?
Well, I think in these early writings, Clay, that was not too far from the way they thought. In the earlier writings, I think their idea of the supernatural was natural made super, and so around the campfire, we're talking about probably some anthropomorphic image of some kind or another, loosely. But when you get to the time when, for an example, the stories begin to get told around God more fully developed, it's pretty clear their sense of the sanctity of God, the differentness of God, begins to be very, very strong and sharply delineated from humankind. To say that, like, for an example, Moses' encounter with God in the burning bush, it's interesting. This little exchange is very revealing about the Hebrew understanding of who God was, because you remember God keeps pushing Moses to go down to Egypt and set his people free, And Moses ends up saying, well, you know, if I do go down there, who the heck am I supposed to say is sending me? Who is this? And God's reply is, I am. I am that I am, period. That's all you can know. Essentially, the answer is, there's no way you're going to get a hold of this. I mean, I am a being beyond any comprehensible capacity you've got. And so the idea of narrowing God down to some sort of expansion of an anthropomorphic image just doesn't work at all, not even back then.
So then wouldn't you say that a lot of atheism and agnosticism perhaps is the result of a frustration that people have with not being able to capture or put God in a box, so then they give up on it?
Well, I don't know what your experience has been, and I'm sure you've had plenty of it, Clay, and I know you have too, Roy. We just bounce into this all the time. But I find most of the people who identify themselves as atheists, most of them are fairly learned people, and they get over there by basically entering the universe. The universe in their mind is an empirical thing. You can measure it, you know, you can manipulate it. It's just a material. It's a, you know, this kind of interface between energy and mass that accounts for everything. There's no room for God to be there. And so most of the people that I've encountered are people who are just saying, where does God fit into this? I can explain everything there is to explain, almost, by science. We know that to be not true, incidentally. Mm-hmm. But that's the view. That's that evacuating a divine hand from the universe leaves it to be, you know, a kind of something obeying the laws of physics that just took place. I do think there are people who get frustrated with an inability to find a way to meaningfully relate to God. And I think that's probably where you're going with that. I don't know what to say about that other than just that's one of the advantages of being a Christian.
Right.
We do have this figure that we believe God is investing the divine self in, and who we can look at and say, well, that's as close to God as we're going to get right there. So I always think about Jesus as being kind of like an owner's manual. You know, I mean, God is dropping this figure in this life in front of us so we can hear and see and watch and see what he does and what kind of a, you know, soul he has, the kind of love he has, and essentially this incarnational theology is telling us this is as much of God as you're going to know right here. And it's all true 100% from one end to the other. So, I mean, it's a perfect incarnation. Is everything in God invested there? I think we'd be really pushing it to say that, even despite John. You know, what we see in Jesus is everything we can see and know, says a Christian about God. So in that sense, you know, I think that's handy. My first experience when I had my conversion experience was of Christ. So that made it accessible to me. Does that make any sense at all, or am I just?
Can you say more about that experience that you're?
Well, yeah, I was an atheist. I mean, I was sophisticated enough philosophically to know that you can't be completely, because you can't prove God and you can't prove there isn't a God. You're just spinning your wheels if you're trying to go that way. But in terms of any kind of empirical proof or a logic that holds up, but I just had this instantaneous conversion experience when I was an atheist, and it was a Christ figure that just kind of came into the room. I don't know how else to describe it. I mean, it's indescribable. I think anybody that's had an experience like that will tell you that. But so but already I was equipped with a pretty good scientific background to kind of let it blow out into that. I don't know what to say other than that. My first thought was Jesus, because I didn't know anything about Christianity to speak of as an adult at all. Yeah, I hadn't been in church in 10 years. And so,
Wow.
but I think that's a good question. And of course, that's the problem that Jewish people have. They may buy the ethical teachings of Jesus for the most part, but they can't imagine, and Muslims, God compressing the God self into a human being. But we find that accessible. I mean, that to us condenses everything into something. So I think that the old saying, like, what would Jesus do? That's not a bad thing to throw out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's something very tangible about that. I think we'll all agree about that.
Yeah, I think as Christians, it gives us a starting point. It gives us, something to work with. It gives us an example, teachings, a way to live, a way to treat other people, a way to, Christ is the bridge for us to God. And without Christ, we are left we can have our imagination and our thoughts about who and what God is and how we relate to God, but we're still kind of grasping at straws, right? With Christ, we have this historical figure who teaches us how to live, how to love, how to serve, how to show love and compassion. And that gives us a place to, so all the theologians that have been impactful in my life are Christocentric theologians, Karl Barth, John Calvin, Moltmann, go down the list.
Yeah. I think that I agree with you, Clay. I think that to talk to Jewish scholars, they will tell you they have a fair idea of what God is like and also Islamic scholars, that God has those characteristics that you're speaking of, and is all loving and all those features that we find so easily identifiable in Jesus. But the reason I mentioned Owner's Manual is, if we look at Jesus, in my opinion, what we're going to see is what God intends for us to become. I mean, we're not going to be Christ, but but that's what it means to be godlike. And I think that Jesus had a pretty literal understanding of what it meant to be a child of God. I think he meant we're supposed to act like little guys like God. We're supposed to be all loving. We are at our most fulfilled when we're living that way. Our most fulfilled human expression is love. And how would we know that? Well, as a Christian, I'm flipping to page 3 of the Owner's Manual, and that's what it says. But that's true with, we find, love your neighbor is a great commandment back in Leviticus. I mean, there's nothing entirely new about that. It's just Jesus carries it to such a refined degree that it becomes kind of predominant over everything else. Yeah.
Dr. Kidd, can I ask you a question?
Sure. I mean, yes, please do.
I'm not a scientist, although I've been exposed to a lot of science in my career, and I'm certainly no theologian, although I try to study. But can you tell me what your explanation or understanding is of the Hebrew word yom, day, in Genesis 1?
You're talking about, I don't have a Hebrew Bible in front of me.
Day.
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 I see it as the presence of light, right? I mean, clearly that's what it's talking about. That's when God says, let there be light, and there is light. And so I think that's light. I mean, I think scientists calculate that probably about roughly 240,000 years after the Big Bang was unleashed, light began to form. Up until that time, it was just a heated plasma without any definition. The hydrogen, for an example, couldn't settle out and attract electrons. It couldn't be formed before that time, so there wouldn't have been light. It would have just been this opaque soup. But very quickly, I think I calculated at one point it was like less than 2% of the time of the 3.7 billion years that we think this universe has been around. That's how quickly light came. It was very fast.
My understanding.
But excuse me. But the formation of stars, where gravity begins to pull together these atoms, it comes later. You know, it is an evolutionary process. Yeah, pardon me. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just talking specifically about, there's constant use of the word day, day 1, day 2, day 3. And my understanding is that there are basically 3 understandings of that. One is daylight, like daytime, in the day. I'm going to go out and go fishing, in the day with my buddy or whatever. And another would be a 24-hour period. And third would be a period of time, like in the day, back in the day. Although my understanding, every time that's used in the Old Testament, that's associated with a preposition. And in the text, it talks about, it doesn't say that. And then it says evening and morning was the first day, and then second even morning was the second day.
It is interesting, isn't it? It's somewhat contradictory to the idea of, but I think if we are willing to accede that light, that God says, "Let there be light," and by golly, there's light. It may take a couple of 100,000 years, but that's nothing in terms of universal time. It's nothing. It's almost instantaneous. It's kind of like the creatio ex nihilo. Scientists calculated there was practically nothing there, and all of a sudden here it is. So light comes early, but this definition of a 24-hour day requires the sun, and that's not till day 4. It's not an unscientific thing to think of light being radiation everywhere that doesn't have that's not congealed into stars, into heavenly bodies yet. So this is not bad. I mean, this passage, the first couple of verses are not bad. I mean, they don't miss it by far if you want to hold their feet to the fire.
I would say that light doesn't require sun.
Well, that would be, yeah, that's what this is.
As a matter of fact, in the New Jerusalem, there's going to be a sun, and the light will be emanating from God. And my understanding of that day 1 is light shone forth because he said it, and it was so. And he says it was so many times in all those verses, as you know. And it wasn't until day 4 that we had the sun, but we had light before that.
Well, I think most astrophysicists would agree with you. I think that they would agree that there was an emanation of light in the early universe that was not yet compacted into what we call these heavenly bodies, stars. And probably the first ones were enormous. When it finally began to form, they probably were enormous stars that became supernova. And they began generating all these different stars that we see. But I think this idea that there was just this energy that makes the world transparent, the universe transparent, is the onslaught of light. And we don't have heavenly bodies in that sense. It's just there's just light out there, not from a single source.
Yeah, with David, there's a couple other folks that have kind of had their hands up. I'd love to move to a few other questions, if that's all right. Chris Stewart, I know you have your hand up. I see it on the screen.
Thanks, Clay. We seem to be having some sort of question about what does God look like? Well, guys, he sent his son, right? why would we think God looked anything other than the way that Jesus looked?
Well, I think that Jesus being in human form is, I don't think we would want to confine God to being magnified times a gazillion. I think that what we see in Jesus is more a revelation of behavior. This is the character of God as far as human beings can know it. I don't think we would want to say God looks like an expanded Jesus. I don't think that's what you're advocating.
No, not at all.
Right.
I think the only image that we would ever possibly comprehend would be an image of love. Now, if you can put that to an image, then that's what God is. But on the other hand, yes, he sent Jesus. He sent Jesus in human form. Again, why would it be so bad to think that God, in our image of what we might think of God, would look a lot like Jesus?
I think that I'm just, this is my personal opinions here, but I think that by the time of the 5th or 6th century BC, the Hebrew understanding, which is essentially what we inherit, is of God, is that God is virtually incomprehensible, and so any effort to say what God is going to invariably fail, because if you have an understanding of that you think you know who God is, what God is, it's not going to be enough.
Well,
And also, Chris,
would it be?
if you look at John 4:24, Chris, where Jesus says, "God is spirit."
Yeah.
That's
Well,
dichotomizing the universe between the material and the spiritual.
if I'm not committing blasphemy, then I certainly have that image. It's certainly, in my mind, it's a lot easier to have a conversation with someone that looks perhaps a little older and a little bit more mature than Jesus. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So Chris, I'll say this, and then I want to go to another question. After many years of wrestling in seminary and beyond with the doctrine of the Trinity, and some people will describe themselves as Trinitarian, others say they have a hard time with it. Ultimately, for me, the Trinity only makes room for the mystery of God. That's kind of where I ended, that the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, just leaves room and reminds me that Christ by himself, God by himself, the Spirit by itself, is incomplete. That we need all three for to continue to wrestle with the mystery. But as Christians, our primary access point clearly is through Jesus Christ and following Christ. I don't know if that makes sense, but in wrestling with the doctrine of the Trinity, that to me has always been a way to keep room for the mystery of God.
Ta-da!
Pardon me.
Other questions or comments? I'm scrolling. I'm looking. Please put your hand up.
Can I throw one out,
Sure.
David? And we're at the end of the hour, so we can't go into this much. You can think about it next week, answer. But you're in Genesis, you're in creation. Part of my earlier discussion about Old Testament God knew is that Genesis conveys the Old Testament idea that God is behind everything. Everything that happens, they
Right.
give credit to God or blame to God.
Yeah.
So the question I can't answer, and if you can help me answer, I'd love it, but I've dealt with this for decades. If God created everything, then where did evil come from?
That's a proverbial question. Yeah, I mean, that's the theological stumbling block right there. That's the one that everybody, the best theologians begin bumping into that and not really being able to adequately answer. They can successfully answer that if what we want is some kind of logical answer. In terms of a hard answer, it doesn't work. We don't know. I mean, I think we just have to come to a point where we say, we don't know. I do think, Clay, when I think about the Trinity, it goes to this point of of who Jesus is in our Trinitarian faith, these are different ways for us to know God, right? And you all experience this, right? Jesus, we can look at Jesus, there's a human being. We believe a divine human being, but we can identify very easily because Jesus is human. When we speak of God the Father, we're essentially talking about God the Creator in my judgment, in my head. And God the Holy Spirit is the God you kind of feel with you. So I just think that there's it's a tripartite division for human convenience. God is one God, right? I mean, we would all agree with this. Indivisible. I mean, Clay, I love the way you were talking about maintaining the mystery of God. I think these stories want that more than anything I do. I think they want us to know the power of God is incomprehensible. We're never going to get our heads around it. We're human beings. We're not, we don't have that kind of, first, we can't handle the scale of it, which is true. I mean, when it comes to actually trying to get your head around what these astrophysicists are saying, my hair catches on fire and my brains get blown out my ears. It is absolutely stunning, the kind of scale that we know is there. So the magnitude of God and the infinitudes, the impenetrable complexity and infinite characteristics they just are not going to resolve into anything we can handle. And I think that these Hebrew teachers, these narratives, which are, as I said, not really all that old in written form, they want to command us to that.
Right.
This is God. This is not you guys.
Mm-hmm.
That they're talking about. They're talking about the one who says something and it happens.
Right. Well, David, would you give us a preview of next week? And then I might, if it's okay, I might ask you to close us out with prayer. Thank you so much for tonight. And we look forward to next week. If you want to say a word about next week and then close us out, that'd be great.
Yeah, I hastily apologize again for this is not natural territory, Clay.
No, you're good.
They're talking to a damn TV. Yeah, well, it makes a difference but anyway, next week we're going to be looking at the older of the two stories, the older of the two narratives. And it is a description, essentially, it's one of the most beautiful descriptions of human nature I've ever seen. And that's what we're going to be looking at. I think it provides us with a kind of archetype of who we are. And I think it's fascinating of our weaknesses, of our strengths, so it addresses essentially the human experience. Whereas this first story is, it deals with the coming forth of the universe.
We have a lot of conversations in our staff meeting about original sin or sin, and we go round and round. But are you going to hit on that next week a little bit?
We certainly can. I can use any of the input any of you fair souls are willing to throw in the hopper here. I mean, as I said, it would be more comfortable just sitting around talking about it, but we're standing lecturing, but you all don't want a 1 hour lecture.
Well, close us out tonight if you don't mind, and it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much, and Pam, great to have you as well.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for your patience. Lord our God, we thank you for the gift of this day of life, for our being able to experience it, to enjoy the beauty and the wonder of our hour and the love that we can share together, and this pilgrimage that we're on to try to become more Christ-like. We ask that you give us bright thoughts of who you are, in the sense that we can kneel before you and wonder at your greatness, your glory, and help us to know what our assignment is here on earth in our time. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.